$400 of dead plants in one summer. That was my container garden in 2019. 13 pots lined up on my porch like headstones in a nursery graveyard, every one of them holding something that had no business being in a container in the first place, and every one of them purchased because a garden center tag told me it would thrive on your patio. I'm Walt Holloway, and after 4 decades of growing in Vermont dirt, I've learned that the biggest mistakes don't happen in the ground. They happen in the pot. See, containers change everything. They change root depth, moisture retention, temperature exposure, winter survivability. A plant that lives 20 years in your yard will die in 18 months in a pot if you pick the wrong one. I know this because I picked the wrong ones 13 times in a single season, and I should have known better. I taught horticulture at UVM for 22 years, and I still fell for it. What I am about to show you is not a list I read in a magazine. This is the receipt. These are the plants I carried home in my own truck, potted in my own soil mix, watered with my own hose, and watched die on my own porch. 13 container plants, $400, one brutal Vermont summer, and not a single one worth the ceramic it sat in. And the last one on this list, a wisteria I was foolish enough to put in a ceramic pot. Cost me the pot, the patio stones, and 2 years of patience I will never get back. So before you walk into that garden center this spring and load your cart with anything that has patio-friendly on the tag, sit down with me for 30 minutes. I will save you every penny I lost. Heritage sprouts, before we get into plant number 1, drop your USDA zone in the comments. Half of these mistakes come from ignoring zone reality, and I want to know where you are gardening so I can tell you which of these 13 plants will burn your wallet in your climate. If you have been burned by a container plant before, tell me which one. And if this is your first season growing in pots, subscribe. What you learn in the next 30 minutes will save you years of trial and a few $100s of error. Here is what nobody at the garden center will explain. A container is not a miniature garden bed. It is a sealed environment with limited soil volume, restricted drainage, amplified temperature swings, and zero buffering from the ground underneath. In summer, a dark-colored pot on a south-facing porch can reach 140 degrees at the root zone. In winter, up here in Zone 4B, that same pot freezes solid, not just the soil surface, but every root from rim to bottom. The ground insulates, a pot does not. And this is where my opinion might get me in trouble with the retail crowd. I believe most container plant failures are not the gardener's fault. They are the garden center's fault. They sell tropical plants next to cold, hardy shrubs with the same great for patio signage and let you figure out the difference after your credit card clears. That is not education, that is retail with a green apron. So this list is organized by how much I spent and how fast the plant failed. Number 1 cost me $35 and lasted 6 weeks. Number 13 cost me $40 and is still costing me to this day. Every plant on this list came from a real receipt, a real pot, and a real porch in northern Vermont. Plant number 1, Mandevilla sanderi, $35 at a big box garden center, sitting in a hanging basket with a glossy tag that said tropical color all summer. And it delivered on that promise for about 6 weeks. Here is what the tag did not mention. Mandevilla is rated USDA zone 10 to 11. I garden in zone 4B. That is a 6-zone gap. You might as well buy a parrot and expect it to survive a Vermont January on your mailbox. But there it was, featured on an end cap display right next to the petunias. No zone warning, no asterisk, nothing. Just add tropical flair to your patio. I bought 2, one for each side of the porch steps. $70 for a pair of plants that would be compost by September. They grew fast through July, flowered in that deep pink trumpet shape that looks like a catalog cover. By mid-August, the nights were dipping into the low 50s, and the leaves started curling. By the first week of September, before the first frost even touched, both plants had dropped every leaf. The stems went black and soft like wet paper. I tried to save one by bringing it indoors. It lasted another 3 weeks in the kitchen window and then gave up entirely. A plant evolved for Brazilian rainforest humidity and 12-month growing seasons does not want your kitchen windowsill in Vermont. The embarrassing part, and I say this because someone needs to hear it, I actually bought a third one the following June. Same store, same end cap, same tag. I looked at it and thought maybe I could keep it alive if I brought it in before the nights cooled. 40 more days. That was my return on a third $35 investment. 40 days of pink flowers and then a black stem in a pot on the kitchen counter. Don't be Walt. Plant number 2, dwarf Alberta spruce, Picea glauca conica. $40 for a tidy little evergreen cone that the garden center pitched as the perfect year-round container accent. Here is my take, and I will stand behind it at any nursery counter in this country. Dwarf Alberta spruce in a container is one of the most misleading products in the entire garden retail industry. The word dwarf does not mean small, it means slow. This tree will eventually reach 12 to 15 feet tall. It simply takes its time getting there. In the ground, that slow growth rate works in your favor because the root system has room to expand proportionally. In a 20-inch pot on your front stoop, the roots hit the wall in 2 seasons and the tree starts to starve from the inside out. But that is not what killed mine. Spider mites killed mine. Dwarf Alberta spruce is a spider mite magnet in contained environments. The restricted airflow around a pot on a porch, combined with reflected heat from the house siding, creates the exact conditions that spider mites prefer: warm, dry, still air. By the 2nd August, the interior needles had turned brown and started falling. By the following spring, the tree had that hollowed-out look where the outer shell is still green, but everything inside is dead and gray, like a Christmas ornament with nothing behind it. The Missouri Botanical Garden lists spider mites as the single most significant pest problem for this cultivar, and containers make the problem exponentially worse by concentrating every stress factor into a confined root zone with no escape. I kept that tree on my porch for 3 years total, telling myself the brown patches would fill in. They did not fill in. $40 for a slow-motion funeral in a terracotta casket. Plant number 3, hybrid tea rose, Rosa times hybrida. $25 for a grafted specimen in a 5-gallon nursery pot, wrapped in a sleeve showing a perfect crimson bloom against a white trellis. I've been turning this same soil since Nixon was president, and I still let a pretty label override everything I know about root architecture. Hybrid tea roses need depth. They are grafted plants, which means the bud union, that knobby junction where the rootstock meets the scion, has to sit at a specific level relative to the soil line. In a garden bed, you bury it 2 inches below grade in cold climates to protect it from winter kill. In a container, that bud union is exposed to whatever the pot temperature decides to be on any given day. In July, that means roasted. In January, that means frozen through. Mine bloomed once. 1 flush of flowers in June, respectable but not exceptional. Then the Japanese beetles arrived and perforated every petal like a hole punch. I sprayed, I picked, I cursed. By August, the plant had powdery mildew so thick the leaves looked like they had been dusted with flour. By October, the canes were blackened and the bud union was soft to the touch. I left the pot on the porch through winter because Cornell Cooperative Extension says you can overwinter roses in containers if you insulate the pot with burlap and straw. I did all of that: burlap, straw, a windscreen on the north side. Come April, I unwrapped a dead stick in frozen soil. The bud union had split, a clean horizontal crack across the graft junction. That is what freeze-thaw cycles do to a graft in an uninsulated root zone. The math on hybrid tea roses in containers is simple. The investment in soil, fertilizer, pest management, and winter protection exceeds the cost of the plant within the first season. You are paying $25 for the privilege of spending $50 more trying to keep it alive. Put the rose in the ground or do not grow it at all. Plant number 4, gardenia, Gardenia jasminoides. $30, and the only plant on this list I purchased entirely because of the smell. I knew it was rated zone 8 to 11. I knew I garden in zone 4B. I bought it anyway because I stood in the garden center with my nose in those white blooms and decided that reason could wait. Here is the opinion the sales associate will never share with you. Gardenias are the most pH-dependent plant commonly sold for containers, and almost no one buying them understands what that means in practice. Gardenias require acidic soil, a pH between 5.0 and 6. Most commercial potting mixes sit between 6.0 and 6.5. That half-point gap might not sound significant, but pH is a logarithmic scale. A half-point shift represents a 3-fold change in hydrogen ion concentration, and gardenias respond to that shift immediately and visibly. Within 3 weeks of potting, the leaves started yellowing between the veins, classic interveinal chlorosis caused by iron lockout in insufficiently acidic soil. The iron was in the soil. The plant could not access it because the pH was wrong. It is like putting food behind a locked door and blaming the guest for not eating. I amended with sulfur. I watered with diluted vinegar. I bought chelated iron and applied it according to the extension schedule. The plant stabilized for about a month and then dropped its flower buds overnight. Every single bud scattered on the floor of my porch like a protest vote. Gardenias also despise temperature fluctuation. They want consistent warmth, 70 to 75 degrees during the day, 60 to 65 at night. A Vermont porch in June can swing from 48 degrees at dawn to 82 by mid-afternoon. That is not consistency. That is a thermal roller coaster for a plant that evolved expecting a spa. Dead by August. $30 for 2 months of yellow leaves and horticultural anxiety. Plant number 5, Boston fern Nephrolepis exaltata. $20 for a lush green sphere of fronds that looked like a postcard from a southern veranda. The Boston fern might be the most photographed porch plant in America and the least understood. Every home magazine, every real estate staging company, every cozy front porch Pinterest board features a Boston fern in a hanging basket next to a rocking chair. What those photographs do not capture is the carpet of tiny brown leaflets that a Boston fern drops every single day of its life. They are called pinnae, and they shed continuously. They get in between the porch boards. They blow through the screen door. They stick to the bottoms of your shoes and track into the kitchen. Sweeping your porch becomes a daily activity, not a weekly one. But shedding is a cosmetic annoyance. The real issue is water. Boston ferns are native to tropical and subtropical forests where humidity rarely dips below 60%. On a Vermont porch in July, afternoon humidity can drop below 30% on a dry day. The fern responds by going crispy at the tips, then browning inward from the leaf margins. I watered mine twice daily during the hottest weeks, morning and evening, twice. And the fronds still turned brown at the edges because the problem was not soil moisture but ambient air humidity. No amount of watering from the top compensates for air that is too dry for the species to maintain turgor pressure in its tissues. If you miss a single day of watering during a heat wave, one day, one missed evening check, the damage to that set of fronds is permanent. They do not recover. They brown, they shed, and you wait for new growth that may or may not emerge before the season ends. The plant punishes a single missed watering with weeks of visible damage. Mine lasted until Labor Day. 3.5 months of twice daily watering and daily sweeping for a plant that never once looked as good as it did the day I brought it home from the nursery. Plant number 6, elephant ear, Colocasia esculenta. $25 for a tuber the size of a baseball that the catalog promised would produce dramatic tropical foliage up to 2 feet wide. I want to tell you something that I do not see discussed enough in any gardening content on this platform or anywhere else. Elephant ear in a container is an engineering problem, not a horticultural one. The mature plant reaches 3 to 4 feet tall with leaves that act as sails in any wind above 10 miles per hour. A standard 18-inch container does not have enough base weight to counterbalance a top-heavy plant catching an afternoon breeze. Mine tipped over 4 times in one summer. Twice on the porch, cracking a pot saucer and scattering wet soil across the boards. Once down the porch steps, 3 steps, slow tumble, soil trail on everyone. And once off a plant stand, which was my own fault for putting a plant with that center of gravity on a stand in the first place. Beyond the tipping problem, Colocasia needs water the way a Labrador needs attention. Constantly, unreasonably, and with visible disappointment when you fall short. This is a wetland plant. It evolved in swamps and stream margins across Southeast Asia. It wants boggy, saturated, standing water conditions. A container with drainage holes is the structural opposite of what this plant expects from its environment. I watered daily and the leaf edges still dried and curled. I put the pot in a deep saucer filled with water to maintain boggy conditions, and the mosquitoes arrived within a week. Standing water in a saucer in a Vermont July is a breeding invitation that every mosquito within a quarter mile will accept. There is no clean solution that satisfies both the plant and the porch. The tuber storage over winter is its own ordeal. Dig it out before frost, dry it for a week, wrap it in newspaper, store it in a cool, dark place between 45 and 55 degrees, check monthly for rot. I did that for 2 winters before deciding that $25 was not enough to justify the annual custody arrangement with a tuber the size of a fist. Plant number 7. Bougainvillea glabra. $35 for a thorned vine in a gallon pot, blooming in that electric magenta that makes you forget every practical concern you have ever held. Here is what needs saying, and I will say it plainly. Bougainvillea is a Zone 9 to 11 plant that the garden industry has successfully rebranded as a summer annual for northern gardeners. The marketing works because the blooms are spectacular, those papery bracts in magenta, orange, purple, white. No temperate zone plant produces color at that intensity. But marketing is not horticulture, and color does not equal compatibility with your climate. Bougainvillea has thorns. Not the polite thorns of a garden rose that you can work around with a decent pair of gloves. Bougainvillea thorns are curved, rigid, and hidden beneath the bracts and foliage, where you cannot see them until they are in your hand. Repotting, pruning, deadheading, moving the pot to a new location. Every interaction with this plant draws blood. I stopped deadheading mine by mid-July because reaching into the canopy meant getting stabbed 3 or 4 times per session. The bracts drop constantly. They litter the porch boards, they blow into the yard, they stick to wet surfaces and leave pink stains on concrete. Cleaning up after a bougainvillea in full bloom is like cleaning up after a confetti cannon that runs on a continuous loop from June through September. And the overwintering question, because someone always asks, is this. You can bring it indoors if you have a south-facing window with at least 6 hours of direct light. The plant will drop every bract and most of its leaves within 2 weeks of the move. It will sit in your living room looking like a thorned skeleton for the next 6 months until April. Then you carry it back outside, get stabbed carrying it through the doorframe, and wait another 6 weeks for it to cycle back into bloom. You spend 8 months managing an unhappy plant for 4 months of thorned, messy, staining color on your porch. $35 for a cycle of beauty and resentment that only ends when you throw the pot in the yard sale pile. We are halfway through this list, heritage sprouts, and we have already burned through $210 of container regret. 7 plants, 7 lessons, and 7 pots that held nothing but expensive soil while their contents declined and died. If any of this sounds like your own porch, tap that subscribe button because I have 6 more plants to go, and the worst one is still coming. That's not gardening, that's gambling with a price tag. And I want every one of you to stop gambling before your next garden center trip. Share this with someone who is loading their cart right now. Plant number 8, Lantana camara. $15, the cheapest plant on this list, and the one that caused the most trouble beyond money. Lantana is sold in northern garden centers as a heat-tolerant annual for containers and hanging baskets. The flower clusters are colorful, those shifting gradients from yellow to orange to pink on the same head, and the plant is genuinely drought-tolerant once established. I will give it that. If your only criteria are color and low water demand, Lantana delivers. Here is the problem no tag mentions. Every part of Lantana camara is toxic. The unripe berries are toxic to dogs, cats, and young children. The foliage causes contact dermatitis in sensitive individuals. The plant is classified as a noxious invasive species in multiple states and by several countries around the world. It appears on the Global Invasive Species Database, the same international list that includes kudzu and Japanese knotweed. Rosie was the one who caught it. She was always more careful about what we brought into the garden when the grandchildren were small enough to put things in their mouths. She saw the lantana on the porch railing and had it identified by dinner time. Walt, that plant is poisonous to dogs and toddlers, and we have both arriving this weekend. She was right, as she usually was about anything involving the safety of small things. I moved the lantana off the porch and into the yard sale pile that same evening. In warmer climates, Zone 8 and South, lantana escapes containers readily and naturalizes aggressively in disturbed ground. It forms dense thickets that displace native plants and reduce local biodiversity. The berries spread by birds who eat the ripe fruit, and once it establishes a foothold, it is almost impossible to eradicate without repeated herbicide application. Florida and Texas spend millions of dollars annually managing lantana invasion on public lands. Selling it in a container with a cheerful tag and no toxicity warning does not change what the plant does the moment it gets a chance. $15. I got a refund only because Rosie made me drive back to the garden center and explain why the tag should have carried a warning label. Plant number 9, English lavender, Lavandula angustifolia. $20 for a plant I had no business putting in a container, and I say that knowing full well that English lavender is one of the finest perennials you can grow in the ground. Here is the opinion that will generate mail. Lavender is one of the few common garden plants that performs objectively worse in a container than planted directly in the earth. And the reason comes down entirely to root zone moisture dynamics. Lavender evolved in the rocky, fast-draining limestone soils of the Western Mediterranean. It wants dry feet, not moist, not evenly watered, dry. The roots need to dry out completely between waterings, or they develop rot at the crown. A container with a saucer underneath, which is how 90% of container gardeners set up their pots, because nobody wants water staining their porch, traps moisture at the bottom of the root zone. Even with drainage holes in the pot, even with a layer of gravel at the base, water pools in that saucer and wicks back up through the drain holes by capillary action. The root zone stays damp. Lavender roots sit in that persistent moisture and develop crown rot, a fungal infection that kills the plant from the center outward. The first visible sign is usually a gray or brown patch appearing in the middle of an otherwise green plant. By the time you notice it, the crown tissue is already dead. I grew mine in a terracotta pot with a custom sand-heavy mix, 70% coarse sand, 30% potting soil. No saucer, extra perlite, textbook drainage. It still developed crown rot by the 2nd August because Vermont's summer humidity, which averages between 65 and 75% through July and August, kept the ambient moisture around the crown too high for a plant whose genetics expect Provence. The plant wants southern France. I gave it northern Vermont. Those are fundamentally different conversations about water. In the ground, lavender roots can spread laterally through well-drained soil, moving away from the crown into drier zones. In a pot, there is nowhere for the roots to go. The moisture is inescapable and the rot follows. $20 for a plant that taught me there is a real difference between a species that survives your zone and a species that thrives in your container. Plant number 10, Japanese maple, Acer palmatum. $55. The most expensive single plant on this entire list, and the one I defended the longest before finally admitting it was a mistake. Heritage sprouts. I want you to hear this from someone who spent 3 full years trying to make it work before giving up. Japanese maples in containers in cold climates is a project that only succeeds when you are willing to treat the tree like a patient in long-term intensive care. If you want a patio tree you can water and enjoy without constant intervention, this is not that tree. The first problem is root hardiness versus air hardiness. Acer palmatum is rated zone 5 to 8 when planted in the ground. In a container, the root system is exposed to temperatures approximately 2 full zones colder than the ambient air temperature. A zone 5 air temperature creates zone 3 conditions inside the pot walls. My zone 4B Vermont winters were subjecting the roots to effective zone 2 temperatures, well below what Acer palmatum roots can tolerate without cellular damage. The fine feeder roots die first, and the tree emerges from dormancy each spring with diminished nutrient uptake capacity. Each April it leafed out thinner and later than the year before. The second problem is wind exposure. Japanese maples produce delicate, deeply lobed leaves, the lace leaf varieties especially, that tear and desiccate in sustained wind above 15 miles per hour. A patio or deck is an exposed, elevated environment with no natural windbreak of surrounding plantings. My tree sat on the south side of the porch and caught every afternoon thermal that funneled through the valley. By July, the leaf margins were scorched and curling. By August, the tree looked like fall had arrived 2 months ahead of schedule. The third problem is confinement. Acer palmatum develops a dense, fibrous root system that fills any container within 2 growing seasons. Repotting a $55 specimen tree into a progressively larger and heavier pot every other year is a commitment that escalates in weight, cost, and labor. My final container weighed over 80 pounds when wet with soil and water. Moving it into the garage for winter protection required 2 people and a hand truck. 3 years, $55, 2 repottings, annual wind damage, progressive winter root loss, and a tree that looked worse every spring. I planted it in the ground in year 4, and it has been healthy and beautiful every season since. The lesson cost me 3 years, but it was simple. Some trees belong in the earth, not in a pot. Plant number 11, Italian cypress, Cupressus sempervirens. $30 for a 2-foot column of Mediterranean elegance that a catalog described as architectural flair for any entryway. The plant doesn't read the label. Italian cypress reads its own genetics, and those genetics say grow to 40 feet tall and drive a root system deep into limestone hillsides across southern Italy and Greece. You can place it in a 24-inch pot on your front porch and call it a topiary accent. The tree calls it a temporary holding cell with an expiration date. Italian cypress is rated zone 7 to 11. I garden in zone 4B. That alone should have been enough to keep my wallet closed. But the catalog photograph showed a matched pair flanking a front door, clipped to about 4 feet, standing like sentinels at a Tuscan villa entrance. I wanted that. I wanted the aesthetic. I ignored the zone rating, the eventual mature height, the native Mediterranean habitat, the complete absence of any reason to believe this would work on a farmhouse porch in northern Vermont. I ignored everything that 22 years of teaching should have made me unable to ignore, and I bought 2. The first one lived through summer. By October, the foliage had shifted from deep green to a dull bronze, which I told myself was normal winter dormancy coloring. By February, the bronze had darkened to brown. By April, the brown was clearly dead tissue. The entire root ball was frozen solid when I tipped the pot to inspect. Not surface frost, but frozen completely through, like a block of ice with roots suspended inside it. Even in the correct hardiness zone, Italian cypress in a container is a long-term structural failure waiting to happen. The narrow columnar form means the canopy stays tight while the root system attempts to expand laterally. Inside a round pot, the roots circle the perimeter, a condition called girdling, and eventually constrict and strangle themselves. Cornell Cooperative Extension documents this pattern extensively in container-grown columnar conifers. The very shape that makes Italian cypress look attractive in a pot is the same shape that guarantees root failure in a pot. $30 each times 2. $60 total for 9 months of declining Tuscan fantasy on a Vermont porch. Plant number 12, bird of paradise, Strelitzia reginae. $30 for a clump of thick, paddle-shaped leaves that the nursery associate assured me would bloom with enough patience and good southern light. I had the southern light. I had the patience. What I did not have was the 30 years it apparently takes for a containerized Strelitzia to feel generous enough to produce a single flower stalk in a northern climate. Here is what the nursery associate either did not know or chose not to share. Bird of paradise blooms when it reaches physiological maturity, which under ideal conditions, zone 9 to 11, in-ground, full South African sun, takes 4 to 5 years from division. In a container in zone 4B, with 6 months of indoor overwintering under imperfect windowsill light, that maturity timeline stretches considerably. Some container specimens in northern climates never bloom at all. They produce foliage, beautiful, architectural, lush, evergreen foliage that belongs on a magazine cover, but no flowers. The signature crane-like bloom that gives the plant its common name, the entire visual reason most people hand over their money, remains a promise printed on the nursery tag and a photograph on someone else's internet post. I kept mine for 5 years. 5 autumns of hauling it indoors before first frost, 5 springs of hauling it back out after last frost. The plant grew larger each year, heavier each year, in a pot that eventually measured 20 inches across and weighed north of 60 pounds wet. By year 3, it had 7 leaf fans and 0 flower stalks. By year 5, it had 12 leaf fans and still 0 flower stalks. It occupied premium real estate on my best south-facing porch exposure and returned nothing but a green wall that required quarterly fertilization, biannual repotting, and daily space on a porch that had other uses. I donated it to the UVM greenhouse in Burlington. The department head, a colleague from my teaching years, told me it might produce a bloom in another few years under controlled glass with supplemental lighting and a consistent 70-degree environment. Another few years in a university research greenhouse. Not on a Vermont porch where the overnight low hits 30 degrees in the first week of October. $30 and 5 patient years for a houseplant that occupied the spot where a blooming hydrangea paniculata could have lived rent-free. Plant number 13, the last one. The one that earned its place at the end of this list not because it cost the most money, $40, but because it cost me more than any receipt can show. Wisteria sinensis, Chinese wisteria. And if there is one container plant I regret more deeply than all the others combined, it is this vine, because this is the only plant on the list that fought back. I bought the wisteria from a specialty mail-order nursery that ships grafted specimens across the country. Not a big box impulse buy, a deliberate research purchase from a reputable grower. The catalog listed it as suitable for container bonsai training and patio display, which sounded like exactly the project I had been wanting. A wisteria trained over the edge of a large ceramic pot on the patio, those long purple racemes draping down like a waterfall, like a living Japanese painting on my own flagstone. My grandfather grew wisteria on a pergola behind the original farmhouse, the one his father built in 1894. I watched those blooms every May morning when I was a boy, eating oatmeal at the kitchen table while the purple clusters hung outside the window like chandeliers made of flowers. I wanted that memory in a container on my own patio. 40 years later, and 100 feet from that same kitchen window. Sentiment, it turns out, is a terrible purchasing guide for plants. Here is what I should have understood before I ordered, and what I need every person watching this to internalize before they consider the same mistake. Wisteria sinensis is classified as an invasive species across multiple states in the eastern United States. The USDA Invasive Plant Atlas tracks it. State forestry departments and natural heritage programs list it as a species of concern. It is restricted or banned from commercial sale in some jurisdictions. This is not a well-mannered garden ornamental that stays where you put it. This is a plant that grows to 60 feet in the wild, that generates hydraulic root pressure sufficient to crack poured concrete foundations, that sends woody runners beneath sidewalks and into municipal sewer lines, and that has been documented by structural engineers lifting porch joists off their support posts. In a container, that root pressure has nowhere to dissipate except into the container walls themselves. My $40 wisteria cracked a $120 Italian glazed ceramic pot in its second growing season. Not a hairline stress fracture, a structural failure that split the pot vertically from rim to base sometime overnight. I found it on the patio at 6 in the morning, the root mass pushing visibly through the gap, wet soil fanning out across the flagstones in a dark crescent like the plant was staging an escape attempt. I repotted it into a thick-walled plastic nursery container, the commercial-grade kind that wholesale growers use for balled and burlap trees. By the third growing season, the roots had physically deformed that pot from a circle into an oval. The drainage holes at the bottom, which had started as clean circular openings, were now elongated slits where the roots had pushed through the plastic and begun anchoring into the pea gravel beneath. When I lifted the pot that October to bring it under cover, it pulled up a 12-inch section of the landscape fabric underneath. The roots had grown through the fabric and into the gravel substrate beneath, and the bloom question, because flowering is the reason anyone subjects themselves to wisteria in the first place. Wisteria sinensis takes 7 to 15 years to produce its first blooms from seed, and 3 to 5 years from a grafted cutting under what the literature calls ideal conditions. Ideal conditions means full sun for at least 6 hours, deep unrestricted soil, a fully established and expanding root system, consistent moisture without waterlogging, and annual phosphorus feeding. A container on a patio provides none of these at the level the species requires for floral initiation. My grafted specimen produced 0 blooms across 3 full growing seasons. The Missouri Botanical Garden notes specifically that container-grown wisteria may delay flowering even longer than ground-planted specimens due to the compounding effects of root restriction, nutrient depletion in confined soil volume, and physiological stress. I spent 3 years managing a plant that cracked premium imported pottery, deformed commercial-grade plastic, invaded the patio substructure through landscape fabric, and never produced a single flower cluster. 3 years of pruning twice per season, because wisteria grows with the urgency and aggression of something that knows it is being contained, and the pruning itself became an event. The vines lignify into woody, muscular stems within 1 season. They do not clip cleanly with hand pruners after the first year. By year 2, I needed loppers. By year 3, I was using a pruning saw on a container plant, a pruning saw, on a plant sitting on my patio in a pot. That is the moment you should know. Something has gone fundamentally wrong with your gardening choices. My grandfather's wisteria on the farmhouse pergola bloomed every May for over 40 consecutive years without fail. But that wisteria was planted in the open ground with 30 feet of deep Vermont soil in every direction, and a pergola constructed from pressure-treated 6x6 posts lag-bolted into poured concrete footings. That is the infrastructure that Wisteria sinensis demands and deserves. A glazed ceramic pot on a flagstone patio surrounded by landscape fabric is not infrastructure. It is an invitation for the plant to demonstrate exactly how inadequate your preparations were. I removed the wisteria at the end of year 3. The root mass had fused with the landscape fabric underneath the pot. I cut the fabric around the root ball with a utility knife and disposed of the entire assembly as a single unit. Pot, roots, soil, fabric, and the 3 displaced flagstones that the root pressure had tilted out of level over 2 growing seasons. Total cost when the project was finished: the $40 plant, the $120 ceramic pot it destroyed, the replacement nursery pot it deformed, a new roll of landscape fabric, 3 replacement flagstones, 2 hours of patio restoration labor on a Saturday afternoon, and 3 years of biannual pruning time I will never recover. $40 on the original receipt, closer to $300 when the final accounting was done, and 0 blooms to show for any of it. 13 plants, $400. One summer that taught me more about container gardening than 22 years of teaching horticulture at a state university. Heritage sprouts, what I want you to carry away from this is not that container gardening itself is a mistake. It is not. I grow containers to this day: culinary herbs, compact cherry tomatoes, proven cold-hardy shrubs like boxwood and dwarf hydrangea. Containers work beautifully when you match the plant to the pot, the zone to the reality, and the expectation to the biology. They fail every single time when you match the plant to the photograph on the price tag instead. If you are standing in a garden center at this moment with your phone in one hand and a cart handle in the other, and something in that cart appeared on this list, put it back on the shelf. That is not a defeat. That is the smartest $30 you will save all season. The 3 sources I referenced for zone data, pest profiles, and care recommendations throughout this video are the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder, the Cornell Cooperative Extension Home Gardening Resource Library, and the UVM Extension Master Gardener Program. All free to access, all available online, and all considerably more honest than any garden center price tag you will ever read. I will keep making new mistakes. 67 years on this hillside, and I have not yet exhausted the ways a man can waste money on plants. But I have stopped making these particular 13 mistakes, and after today, so have you.